For United States President Barack Obama, it's about leadership, legacy, and the spread of nuclear weapons. But for Israel, in the view of Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, it's about Israel's very survival. The disagreement over the Iran nuclear deal has driven a wedge between the two historic allies. And as the debate rages in the United States Congress over whether to support the historic agreement, millions of dollars are being spent by influential Jewish groups in search of votes. Later, we'll talk with a former U.S. ambassador to Israel, an Iranian scholar, and an Israeli journalist who supports the agreement. But first, the battle for hearts and minds. Here's CCTV's Jim Spellman.
The Iran nuclear deal made it past the negotiating table and through the UN Security Council, but it still faces an uphill fight in the United States Congress.
There is broad international consensus around this issue, not just among the international community, but also among experts in nuclear proliferation. And my working assumption is that Congress will pay attention to that broad-based consensus.
The agreement is expected to prevail, but not without a fight. The loudest voices in the debate come from advocates for a country which doesn't get a vote, Israel.
The Iran nuclear deal, good deal or bad deal?
Opposing the deal is the pro-Israel lobbying group AIPAC, the American Israel Public Affairs Committee, which is funding this ad and plans on spending at least $20 million.
Congress should reject a bad deal. We need a better deal.
Supporting the agreement is the liberal Jewish group J Street.
When he negotiated a nuclear deal with the Soviet Union, Ronald Reagan said, "Trust but verify."
The advocacy group is spending millions of dollars to run this ad that uses images of Ronald Reagan to appeal to conservatives.
It's good for America, good for Israel, and makes both countries safer and more secure.
In addition to the TV spots, groups like these will run ads in newspapers and mount online campaigns to shape public opinion before the 60-day congressional review period is up in September. Opponents of the agreement say it's bad for Israel.
Here's the truth. They say this agreement makes war more distant. This is not true. This agreement brings war closer.
But the administration stands by the deal.
The President of the United States fundamentally believes that we will not do anything that would undermine Israel's security.
Jews in the U.S. and Israel are divided. A poll by the Los Angeles Jewish Journal shows 53% of U.S. Jews say Congress should pass the agreement, while only 41% of all Americans support congressional passage. Israeli Jews are more skeptical. According to a Jerusalem Post poll, 51% say Israel should do everything possible to block the deal in the U.S. Congress. 38% say Israel should reach an understanding with the U.S. president about implementing the agreement. But there are some prominent Israelis speaking out in support. Among them, two former top intelligence officials and former Prime Minister Ehud Barak. He says the deal isn't perfect, but should be passed.
The most important thing we need to do right now is restore working relations with the White House.
The disagreement is taxing already frayed relations between the U.S. and Israel, but the two countries still have many shared interests and common enemies, like the Lebanon-based militant group Hezbollah.
The United States of America, the Great Satan, will stay the Great Satan before and after the nuclear deal.
U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry says if the deal is blocked in Congress, Israel will likely take much of the blame and become more isolated in the international community. But despite these tensions, the U.S. has no plans to stop funding Israel with some $3 billion a year in mostly military aid. Anand?
Thanks, Jim. That's CCTV's Jim Spellman reporting. Well, joining us here in Washington right now is Matthew Brodsky. He's a senior Middle East analyst with the online firm Wikistrat and a frequent contributor to the Huffington Post and the Times of Israel. And with us from Tel Aviv is Gideon Levy. He's an editorial board member and columnist for the Israeli newspaper Haaretz. Thanks to both of you for joining us. Yeah. Gideon, let me start with you. You are a supporter of this nuclear deal with Iran. You have called it an important, incredible diplomatic achievement. But critics say that this deal has quite a few problems in it, that it doesn't go far enough. Iran will retain the ability to enrich uranium, that the penalties that are in this agreement, should Iran violate this agreement, are very hard to implement. They, in fact, as some have called it, a myth that has been built into this agreement. So why, in your view, is this an incredible diplomatic achievement?
It is an incredible diplomatic achievement, first of all, because it did prevent a war, and maybe a very terrible war. Because if there wouldn't have been an agreement, any agreement, I'm very afraid that Israel would have attacked Iran, and nobody knows how would this end. So first of all, everyone in the world should be happy about preventing any kind of war, especially this kind of war between Israel and Iran. Secondly, any kind of deal is always a problematic deal. There always can be a better deal, because a deal by its nature is a compromise. And always in any deal, if you sell your car, you sell your apartment, or you make a deal with Iran, you have better ideas in your mind, and finally you have to compromise. But by the end of the day, we are facing a new reality in which Israel will be prevented, hopefully, from attacking Iran, and Iran will get back to the family of nations, will get back to international economy, and hopefully will have different motivations. And meanwhile, Iran will be controlled, at least for the coming 10 years. I don't see that anybody could have achieved more than this.
Matthew, you are a critic of this deal.
Oh, yeah.
Gideon just mentioned selling cars, and there's a great analogy you made with selling cars in a recent column you wrote in the Huffington Post. You wrote, the White House rollout of the nuclear deal with Iran has the feeling of a car dealer trying to pull a fast one over his customer. Now, we know most of the details about this deal, the exception, I guess, of those details on the arrangement between all the sides negotiating and the IAEA, that's the International Atomic Energy Agency. We know what's happened. So how has President Obama been engaging in something which is akin to deception?
He's selling something that the majority of the country doesn't want. And absolutely, in Israel, what Gideon represents is a utopian type of, echo chamber. It's really not the majority position of the Israeli opinions from left to right. In the United States, Congress is opposed to the deal, and he's steamrolling it and trying to turn it into it's Jews or Israelis against the deal, and Obama is trying to have his way. It's
but
unfortunate.
Gideon does make the point that this is preventing war.
No, it actually kind of guarantees that it's going to be war, but it guarantees that the war will be in the future, and that war will then be with nuclear weapons. I mean, in 15 years, when the sunset is over, and Iran is free to have a completely industrial-sized nuclear program, that guarantees that there's going to be more problems. I mean, it's one thing when you end slightly in a stalemate or something, and you get to kick the can down the road, as was the case in the end of Lebanon, as was the case in Gaza. This ends with a nuclear weapon for Iran. Bad.
Gideon, what about that point that essentially the United States and its allies have kicked the can down the road here? This is a limited lifespan, this agreement. It ends in 15 years. Will that then give Iran the ability to develop a nuclear weapon?
First of all, 15 years is, especially in the Middle East, a long period of time. But I would like just to react about the question if it's a majority or minority. The fact is that the majority of the states of the world are supporting this agreement. The fact that the Jewish lobby is working hard in the American Congress to try to sabotage this agreement does not mean anything about the very, very clear position of the West, of most of the European countries and others in supporting this agreement. And besides, maybe in Israel, I am in minority, for sure I'm in minority, like in many other attitudes, but how many times in history minorities were right and majorities, big, vast majorities, were totally wrong? There are many more examples for this than for the opposite. 15 years is a lot of time, and in those 15 years, hopefully things will go for better alternatives. The only thing that I don't see is what is the alternative that those who oppose this agreement are suggesting. What is your alternative? I didn't get it. Do you really think you could have gotten a better deal with Iran? I doubt it very much. You prefer an Israeli attack on Iran? Okay, so here we separate.
Matthew, what is the alternative?
The alternative, as has been said, was a better idea, a better deal that you could have. And part of that would be not having a sunset clause. If you're going to have a sunset clause, base it on Iranian behavior. I mean, everything he's saying right there is based on hope. It's not based on reality. The reality is there's no reason to believe Iran's behavior is going to change. So tying their rewards, the sanctions relief, to their behavior would make a difference. A verification system that would actually work. That would be helpful.
Of course, the White House has launched a major sales campaign, if I could use your analogy again, to sell this agreement to Congress especially, to the rest of the world, to the United States. Let's take a listen to what John Kerry said. Let's watch.
And what happens is, if the United States Congress unilaterally walks away from this arrangement that we have reached, we go right back to square one where we were with no alternative. Iran is enriching. We have no inspections. We have no ability to know what they're doing. We don't roll back their program. We're right back where we were, and we are going to head to conflict.
So here we have the Secretary of State saying this gives us the right to inspect, to look very closely, to probe, to see what Iran is up to. The alternative would mean that Iran can do whatever it wants in secret. He also says the alternative is the road to conflict.
Right. It's a great straw man argument. I mean, and the Obama administration has done this repeatedly. The answer is not it's this deal or war. I mean, that is a really stark choice that they try to put it into. You would actually have Obama with a strengthened hand. The president would have a strengthened hand to negotiate more. There's even word from French officials who were part of the negotiation who said that they hope that Congress doesn't pass the deal and that it would give them more leverage and they would like to strengthen the deal. So even when Congress was trying to give Obama the ability to put sanctions in place if they didn't reach the deal, that was rejected by the president. Trying to give him more leverage, he wouldn't even take the leverage to get the best deal. And the administration can't argue that they got the best deal, that they drove the hardest bargain. They're not even doing that. They're just saying, it's my deal or it's war. That's just, it's false.
Gideon, should Iran violate this deal, would you support a military strike against Iranian installations?
It depends what kind of violation. An attack should be really the last of all options. Not the first one and not the second one, but really the last of all. I must remind our viewers that Iran is not, in any case, not the first country in the Middle East which presents nuclear weapons. It's also not the only country in the Middle East which is opposing any kind of control over its nuclear capability. And we must also remember that by the end of the day, any kind of using the nuclear weapons by Iran will be a suicidal actions. Everyone understands very well the meaning if they will ever dare to try. It's suicidal for Iran, it's suicidal for the regime. I'm sure we will not get to it. This is really the worst of the worst. But between this and any attack about any violation, no, not any violation should lead to an attack. But if the West and Israel will come to the conclusion that things are really getting out of control, sure, the military option is always on the table.
Matthew, there's been some support from this deal coming from some, if I could put it, unfamiliar quarters. I mean, there's been support in Israel coming from senior military officials. Ehud Barak, the former prime minister, supports it. The head of Mossad, the Israeli intelligence agency, supports it. All have said that Israel should accept this deal and work at improving relations with the United States right now. What do you make of that?
Well, let me separate two things out. One is if Israel, then there are people who are saying that the deal is going to go through no matter what because the United States will not, the Congress won't be able to override Obama's veto. And then, therefore, we have to figure out what we're going to do to work with the deal. That's one thing. That's different than saying that this is a good deal and I support the deal. Now, there are a number of Israelis who have political axes to grind and who are supporting the deal, and it's not surprising. And they happen to have that opinion. It should be remembered that from the Zionist Union, who is running against Likud for the elections, their own people, do not like the agreement. In fact, anyone who would think that the equivalent of a Democrat in Israel being elected would somehow be in favor of the deal, it's not right. It doesn't exist.
Yeah, I would like to point out another point, which is for me and for people like me, unacceptable. And this is the Israeli interference in domestic American politics. I wonder if the United States of America would have dared to intervene in such a way in Israel domestic politics, trying to take the Knesset, the Israeli parliament, against the government of Israel in a very open way without any limits. What would Israel think about such an interference? Would the United States ever dare to do so?
Yes, they did.
And here on the other side, Israel is total openly interfering in domestic American politics against an elected American president. It never happened before. And I have no doubts that Israel is going to pay for it, maybe much more than the danger of the Iranian bomb.
To be clear, the United States and the Obama administration did get involved in Israeli politics and tried to swing the election against Netanyahu. That was an open secret. Everyone knew that. Number one. Number two, Israel getting involved in American politics, this deal affects them far more immediately than it does the United States.